everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bells so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Kirsten Costas. She was a teenage girl from California and she was viciously murdered one evening in the mid-80s. The police launched a murder inquiry as soon as Kirsten was killed and they looked into and took statements from pretty much everyone in her life, but yet they really struggled to find the killer. However, about 6 months after the crime, when the FBI became involved in the case, they did identify a top suspect in the investigation, a suspect that everyone least expected. So for this week's case, we are going back nearly 4 decades now to the summer of 1984 in the city of Orinda, which is located in Contra Costa County in the state of California in the US. And this is Kirsten Costas. She was a 15-year-old girl who lived in Orinda with her family. Kirsten Marina Costas was born on the 23rd of July 1968. Her parents were called Arthur and Bernadette Costas, and Kirsten was one of 2 children. She had a brother named Peter, and the Costas were a very respectable, hard-working family. They were a pretty wealthy family, actually. Kirsten and her brother had a very nice and, privileged life because their parents were pretty well off and they had good jobs. Apparently, Arthur worked for a big American company called 3M. He worked as an executive, and his wife Bernadette worked at a local community centre. So they both had a good wage coming in and they were very financially stable, financially comfortable. So they were able to provide a lot for their children. As far as I'm aware, Kirsten and her brother Peter had very good childhoods, and by 15 years old, Kirsten was a typical teenage girl. She was a high school student, obviously. She attended the Miramonte High School in Orinda and she excelled in school. Her friends in school described her as being very sociable and outgoing. She was confident and she seemed to be the kind of student that was basically good at anything. She could do anything that she put her mind to. She was very, very sporty and athletic. She loved sports so much. She pretty much got involved in any school sports team she could. She was on the swimming team and she also loved to play soccer and baseball. She loved to dance. And in the summer of 1984, she was feeling very positive and excited because she had just finished her sophomore year and she had found out that the following year, so when she became a junior, she had been selected to be on the cheerleading squad too, which she was thrilled about. And Kirsten was a very, very popular young girl. She had a lot of friends in school and her friends were popular too. She was definitely part of the popular crowd. A lot of the other students looked up to her. They thought that she was beautiful and talented. People knew that her family were wealthy and so they aspired to be like her. I mean, having said that, to be fair, I think a lot of the kids at this school, probably most of the kids actually, came from pretty wealthy families too. I'm not too sure if it's the same now, but back when this case took place in the early to mid-80s, the city of Orinda was known for being a very wealthy, upscale area. A lot of well-off families lived there and it always felt safe. And for a lot of people who lived there, it was almost like the more money you had, the better you were, the better your reputation was, which is not a very nice outlook to have in my opinion, but apparently that's what it was like back then. So yeah, as I was saying, the majority of the students in Kirsten's high school came from very privileged backgrounds in terms of money. And if you didn't come from a background like that, you almost didn't fit in. But Kirsten did, she did fit in, and we all know that there are hierarchies in every high school, and Kirsten and her friends were basically at the top of this hierarchy. And as well as being very excited about joining the cheerleading squad, Kirsten was also over the moon because I believe towards the end of her sophomore year, she also received an invite to join the Bobolinks Club, or the Bobbies as it was also called. And the Bobbies was basically like a sorority in Kirsten's high school, Miramonte High School, and only the most liked and fashionable and popular girls in the school got an invite to join the Bobbies. So it wasn't really a big surprise when Kirsten and a couple of her friends got one. So to sum up, 15-year-old 15-year-old Kirsten Costas was a girl who seemed to have it all. She had a good family, she was wealthy, she had lots of friends, she almost ruled the school. She seemed to have the life that any teenage girl would want, but it was a life that would just suddenly be cut very, very short, because in June of 1984, Kirsten became the victim of a very vicious and violent attack which took place just outside of her home. On the evening of the 23rd of June 1984, a man named Arthur Hillman was in his house. He was just sitting down relaxing when all of a sudden he heard the noise of someone screaming. They were screaming for help, and so he got up and he immediately looked out of his window, and that was when he saw a young woman. She was stumbling around and she was covered in blood. She had blood all over her shirt, and Arthur recognized this young woman. It was actually his neighbor. His neighbors were the Costas family, and this young woman was 15-year-old Kirsten Costas. She had been brutally attacked by someone just meters away from her front door. She'd been stabbed repeatedly with a knife before the attacker just fled the scene. So Arthur immediately ran out of his house and up to Kirsten to help her, and as soon as he reached her, she literally just collapsed into his arms. Her injuries were so severe that she just couldn't hold herself up anymore. As he was holding Kirsten, Arthur shouted to his son to call for an ambulance, call 911. Meanwhile, he was also trying to ask Kirsten what had happened, who had done this to her. But Kirsten couldn't answer. She just could not form a sentence. The only words that she was able to say was, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." Quickly, paramedics and Kirsten's parents, Arthur and Barrett, were at the scene. They weren't actually home at the time that Kirsten was attacked. I believe they were at their son Peter's baseball game that evening, or like out for dinner with his baseball team. But as I understand it, they arrived home within just 5 minutes of Kirsten's attack, and they went straight to the hospital with their daughter. But unfortunately, there was nothing that paramedics could do to save Kirsten. She had lost way too much blood, and so she was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. This was around 10:30 p.m. that night. Kirsten Costas had been brutally murdered at just 15 years old. Sources state that she was stabbed at least 4 or 5 times. I believe these stab wounds were in her stomach and also in her back. So of course, as soon as this attack happened, a murder inquiry was launched, and the police were quickly at the scene of the crime just outside of Kirsten's home and her neighbor's home. They were obviously eager to speak to and take statements from everyone at the scene. I believe a few of Kirsten's neighbors rushed out after hearing her screams, but of course the first person to reach her was Arthur Hillman, so the police really wanted to take an initial statement from him. So they started speaking to Arthur, asking him for his account of what had happened. Did he happen to see the person who had attacked Kirsten? And he said that unfortunately he didn't see the attacker, but he did see something. As he was cradling Kirsten in his arms after she just collapsed, he looked up and he noticed this Volvo car pulling away. It had just been parked up on the side of the road right by where the attack happened, and then as soon as Arthur came outside, the driver just drove away. So he wondered if perhaps the driver of that car was the person who killed Kirsten. Now, unfortunately, because of the fact that he was tending to Kirsten, he was unable to make a note in his head of the car's number plate, so he was just trying to describe the appearance of the car as best he could to the police. But unbelievably, as he was doing this, the Volvo car literally pulled up by the crime scene again. It was the exact same vehicle he had seen after Kirsten was attacked. Arthur was sure of it. So he said to the police, "That's it, that's the car that I saw." And after pulling up, the driver of the car immediately got out and he started walking towards Arthur and the officers. The driver identified himself as being a man named Alex Arnold, and what he told the police next absolutely baffled them. He told them that he was actually a witness to what had happened to Kirsten. Alex Arnold said that he lived in a house not far from Orinda. I think he lived in a town called Moraga in California, which is just over 4 miles away from where Kirsten lived. And he said that earlier in the evening, on the night that Kirsten was killed, he was at his home with his wife and some friends when all of a sudden he heard a knock at his front door. So he opened the door, and standing in front of him was 15-year-old Kirsten Costas. Costas. Now, some sources seem to suggest that Alex Arnold knew Kirsten Costas. They had met before, they were familiar with each other, whereas others suggest otherwise, that they were strangers to each other, so I'm not entirely sure what's accurate there. But anyway, Alex opened the door to Kirsten and he immediately noticed that she seemed quite upset and quite on edge, and so Alex asked her if she was okay, did she need any help with anything? And Kirsten asked if she could please use Alex's phone to call her parents. She said that she had just been out with a friend of hers and that things apparently, quote, got weird. Her friend got weird and she just felt uncomfortable, so she left this friend and decided that she just wanted to go home. So she wanted to use Alex's phone to call her parents and ask if they could come and pick her up. And of course, Alex said yes, that was fine, but unfortunately Kirsten couldn't get a hold of her parents because, if you remember, they were out with her brother Peter that evening. And so, because she had no luck, Alex asked Kirsten if she just wanted him to drop her home. He didn't mind giving her a lift, and Kirsten obviously said yes, please. So they got in Alex's car. Alex pulled out of the driveway, and as he did so, he noticed that there was this like yellow or goldy coloured Ford Pinto car parked nearby. And as soon as Alex started driving away from his house, this Ford Pinto immediately started following them. The car actually followed them all the way to Kirsten's address in Orinda. So Alex asked Kirsten about this. He asked if she knew the person driving it, the person following them. And apparently she just responded saying something along the lines of, oh, just don't worry about it. And then once Alex and Kirsten arrived to her house, Kirsten got out of his vehicle, probably thanked him for the lift, and then she started walking towards her neighbour's home because she knew that her parents were not at home, and I'm guessing that she didn't have a key to let herself in, so she was going to go to her neighbours and just ask if she could stay in their house until her mum and dad arrived back. However, as Kirsten was walking towards their front door and as Alex Arnold was just about to leave and drive off, he noticed that the driver of the Ford Pinto car, the car that had been following them the whole way home, the driver got out of the vehicle and they started running towards Kirsten on the front lawn. The driver was another young woman, by the way, and Alex said that as soon as this other girl approached Kirsten, Kirsten started shouting to her to go away and leave her alone, telling her that she was weird. And following this, the girl that ran up to Kirsten pulled out an 18-inch long butcher's knife and she immediately started stabbing Kirsten with it. Sources state that she stabbed Kirsten twice in the stomach, and then as Kirsten fell to the ground, she stabbed her a couple more times in her back before running back to her car and driving away. Alex Arnold literally witnessed this whole thing as he sat in his car. I imagine the attack must have started and ended within a matter of seconds. As we know, Arthur Hillman ran out of his house upon hearing Kirsten's screams, and he saw Alex Arnold in his Volvo driving away, and Alex told the police that the reason he drove away was because he intended to follow and catch up with the Ford Pinto car with the attacker so that they didn't get away. However, he was unsuccessful. He unfortunately lost the Ford Pinto, and so he turned around and drove straight back to where Kirsten was attacked. And that was when Arthur Hillman pointed the Volvo out to the police, and Alex Arnold got out of his car and he told them this whole story. Now, naturally, the police were a tad suspicious of Alex Arnold at first. They had their doubts that his account was truthful, and they thought that perhaps he was actually Kirsten's killer, and that this story he came up with was just to try and cover his own tracks. So he was looked at as a person of interest, but eventually the police were able to rule him out. They felt confident that he was innocent and that his recollection of what happened to Kirsten was accurate. And so they asked Alex Arnold if he could give a description of the young girl who he saw attacking Kirsten, and he described her as being a, quote, chunky, stringy-haired, blonde teenage girl. And obviously he also told the police that she drove a yellow or gold coloured Ford Pinto too. So now the police had a description of their killer, and as they began looking into the people in Kirsten's life who may have matched this description, they also spoke at length with Kirsten's family, with her parents, asking if they knew of anyone that might have had a motive for wanting their daughter dead. And also I think they asked her parents if they could just provide some more information about Kirsten's movements on the day that she was killed. Did they know who she had been with that day or what she was supposed to be doing. And it was then when Kirsten's mother, Berit, told detectives that I believe a week or two before Kirsten's murder, around mid-June of 1984, whilst Kirsten was actually away at this cheerleader summer camp, she, as in Berit, received a phone call from this young girl who claimed to be the leader or the president of the Bobolinks sorority that Kirsten had obviously been asked to join. And this girl told Kirsten's mother on the phone that Kirsten had been invited to an initiation dinner for the Bobolinks. So Kirsten's mum, Berit, took down a note of the details of this initiation dinner and she gave them to Kirsten when she returned home from cheerleader camp. And it turns out that the date that this dinner was due to take place was the evening of the 23rd of June 1984, the same evening that Kirsten was stabbed to death. However, what the police would come to learn when they looked further into the details of this dinner was that it was actually fake. The police spoke to the other girls who were part of the Bobolinks club and none of them had received an invite to this dinner. In fact, the president of the Bobbies, the one who supposedly made this call, was actually out of town. She was on holiday in Hawaii when this dinner was supposed to take place. So yeah, it was fake. The caller had made up this fake dinner, but why? Well, of course, the police believed that this caller must have been Kirsten's killer, and they made up this initiation dinner to try and lure Kirsten to her death. It was all a setup, and as I said, this call was made at least a week before she was killed. So it seemed as though this crime was premeditated. This wasn't a spur of the moment attack. The killer had planned this to some degree, and the fact that they tried to lure Kirsten to a Bobolinks dinner also suggests that the killer was someone that Kirsten knew. They knew her well enough to know that she had been invited to join the Bobbies, so perhaps the murderer was someone that Kirsten went to school with. Now, unfortunately, at the time in 1984, the police were unable to trace where this call made to the Costas home had come from. They couldn't trace the caller. And so, as I mentioned before, they started looking into the people in Kirsten's life, her friends, her classmates, to try and determine whether any of them could have been the killer. They interviewed a load of people, they asked them for their alibis on the night in question. They even had a few teenage girls undergo polygraph tests to try and gauge whether or not they were lying about their involvement. But as the days went by, it didn't really appear as though the police were getting anywhere. They couldn't identify a top suspect in the case, but they did identify a possible motive that someone may have had for wanting Kirsten gone. Of course, as the police started looking more and more into Kirsten, they obviously found out that she was very popular at school. She was in the popular group, but the popular people, I mean, they are called the popular people, but in actual fact, they aren't often that popular, are they really? A lot of the other students don't tend to like the popular crowd. I know that I didn't like the popular group in my high school because they could often be mean and harsh and judgmental to their classmates. They could make them feel crap about themselves, and they almost view their group as being better and more worthy than anyone else in the school. So when the police learned that Kirsten was in the popular group, they wondered if perhaps she had been killed by a student at the Miramonte High School who hated the populars. Maybe they killed Kirsten because they hated what she represented. She was one of the most popular girls in the school, so perhaps the murderer didn't like what she stood for and decided to almost retaliate by committing a horrific crime and ending Kirsten's life. So with this theory in mind, the police started looking more into the girls who were classed as, I guess you could call them the loners or the rebels of the school, the girls who didn't necessarily fit in and also didn't want to fit in. Could any of them have been the perpetrator? And it was as a result of this when the police did identify one key suspect in the case, a young girl named Nancy Kane. Nancy obviously went to the same school as Kirsten, and she had the kind of stereotypical fashion sense and style of a rebel. You know, she dyed her hair dark with like white highlights, she wore mostly black clothing, she had heavy black eye makeup. She could be a troublemaker at times. She would drink a lot of alcohol and smoke marijuana, and whilst I'm sure a lot of her other classmates, particularly the popular group, would probably make fun of her, Nancy actually loved not fitting in. She loved being different and kind of standing out, and she didn't care what anyone had to say about it. Although, having said that, this kind of rebel phase was new to Nancy. During her freshman year, she was completely the opposite. In fact, she herself used to be fairly popular. She was even friends with Kirsten at one point. But eventually, Nancy just became fed up with the popular girls that she was friends with. She didn't like what they represented, and she didn't want to be associated with them anymore. And so she decided to kind of leave that group and stop being friends with Kirsten, and that was when she became more of a rebel. But the main reason why Nancy Kane kind of skyrocketed right to the top of the police's suspect list was because they discovered that she'd written about Kirsten in her notebook, and what she wrote seemed to be cause for alarm. She wrote, quote, "I want to see Kirsten's blood drip, drip, drip." Now, of course, it's possible that she just wrote this in a kind of spur of the moment anger feeling towards Kirsten and the popular people. It's possible that she didn't actually mean what she wrote, but obviously the police had to investigate her father just in case she did mean it, just in case she wanted to see Kirsten's blood drip so bad that she decided to viciously stab her to death. So Nancy was asked to come down to the police station for an interview, and they asked her where she was on the night that Kirsten was killed, and she said that she had gone to see a movie that night. And so they asked her if she would be willing to undergo a polygraph test. However, she said no. Well, her parents said no. Obviously, because she was a minor, it was her parents' decision whether or not to allow Nancy to sit through a lie detector, and they chose not to allow that. They weren't comfortable with their daughter having to do that. So that made the police a little bit more suspicious of Nancy Kane. They started to wonder if the reason her parents didn't want her to do a polygraph was because they knew that she perhaps had involvement in what had happened to Kirsten. But I mean, regardless of their suspicions, they had nothing concrete to be able to link Nancy to the crime, and so they couldn't charge her with anything. They just had to let her go. But it wasn't long before they were sat down speaking with Nancy again. In fact, I believe she actually went back to the police station herself and said that she had something to confess to them. Nancy Kane confessed that she had actually lied to the police, not about her involvement in the murder. She still maintained that she was innocent of the crime. However, she did admit to the police that she had lied about her alibi that night. She said that she wasn't actually at the movies that evening. Instead, she was with her boyfriend, and she said that the only reason she lied initially was because she didn't want her parents to find out that she was with this boyfriend. Maybe they didn't even know that she had a boyfriend and she wanted to keep it that way, who knows. But regardless, the police checked over this alibi and they could confirm that it was true. She really was with her boyfriend that night, so that was Nancy Kane ruled out. And so the investigation continued, but again, it was slow. The police were following up on tips and leads that they had received from the public. They were appealing to the public constantly, and there was even a reward put forward for information, but nothing was really leading them anywhere, and eventually weeks turned into months. Months went by and there were just no answers. The police could not work out who the killer was. They decided that they needed help with this case, and so they got in touch with the FBI and asked if they could assist them with the investigation into the murder of Kirsten Costas. And as part of the FBI's involvement, they decided to get some experts to create a profile of the killer so that the police could try and potentially match this profile against anyone in Kirsten's life. So the FBI believed that the killer was the same age as Kirsten and that they also lived in Orinda or very close by. They were very familiar with the area. They believed that the use of a knife in the murder suggests that this crime was personal. It was someone who held some sort of grudge against Kirsten and that's why they stabbed her to death. The amount of violence used suggests that this person was angry at Kirsten for whatever reason. And they also believed that the killer would not be the type to show remorse or any guilt for what they had done. And there were also some other traits and characteristics listed that the FBI came up with as part of this profile too. So upon receiving it, the detectives began comparing it against the teenage girls within Kirsten's circle, her friends and classmates. And following this, they came to a realization. They realized that the profile seemed to match one classmate in particular, teenager Bernadette Protti. Bernadette was 16 years old at the time that this case occurred. She attended the same high school as Kirsten and she was kind of friends with Kirsten. They were both in the popular group at school. They'd both been invited to join the bobolink sorority. And one of the main reasons why Bernadette eventually started to look like a promising suspect in the case was because basically, I believe it was a good few months into the murder investigation when Kirsten Costas' parents, Arthur and Barrett, decided to hire their own private investigator to also look into the case alongside the police, because obviously they were just desperate for answers and they wanted someone to find the killer as quickly as possible, whether it be this PI or the Orinda detective. So yeah, Arthur and Barrett Costas hired a PI and this PI started going through Kirsten's case files and looking over statements that the police had taken and looking further into the people that they had already questioned. And that was when this PI came across Bernadette Protti's name in the case file. Obviously, because she was a friend or an acquaintance of Kirsten's, she was one of the first people that the police spoke to and questioned, and she was reportedly very cooperative with the detective. She agreed to sit through a polygraph test, although different sources seem to say different things regarding the results of this polygraph test. Some sources state that she passed it, others state that the results were inconclusive, and some state that she failed it. So I really don't know what is accurate there. I mean, let's be honest, polygraph tests are notoriously inaccurate anyway, and that's why they can't be used as evidence during a trial or anything. But yeah, overall, she was very cooperative with the police, willing to answer any questions. Nothing about her or her behaviour seemed to be cause for alarm, or at least that was until the private investigator took a further look into Bernadette Protti's alibi from the night of the murder. You see, when she was first questioned by the police, Bernadette told the detectives that on the night in question, she was nowhere near the crime scene because she was babysitting. She was babysitting for this family that she babysat for often, and for whatever reason, the police didn't actually check this alibi at the time. Perhaps it was because, as I said, Bernadette didn't arouse suspicion, so they just didn't feel the need to, who knows? But yeah, this alibi went unchecked for months until the PI became involved in the case and they decided to check through people's alibis, including Bernadette. So this PI rang the family who Bernadette said she was babysitting for that evening, and they were shocked to find out that Bernadette had actually lied about that. She wasn't babysitting that night. In fact, it turns out that she hadn't even babysat for that family for about a year before this case occurred. So she didn't have an alibi anymore. And why would she lie about her whereabouts? It was clear that she had something to hide. So the PI passed on this information about Bernadette's false alibi to the police, and they asked Bernadette to come in for another interview. This was in December of 1984, so about 6 months or just under 6 months after Kirsten was murdered. Now, as I mentioned before, the police also believed that Bernadette Protti matched the profile of the killer that the FBI had come up with. She knew the victim well. She knew Kirsten. She was around the same age. She lived in Orinda. If she was the killer, she'd never displayed any kind of remorse for the crime. Just as a side note, she did actually go to Kirsten's funeral, where apparently she displayed emotion. She got very upset. She was upset that her friend was gone, which, if she was the killer, how creepy is that? The fact that she went to Kirsten's funeral and she was acting like she was this grieving friend when in reality she was the one who committed the crime. In addition to that, she also matched the description of the attacker, which was given by Alex Arnold. She was a blonde-haired teenage girl, and what the police also later discovered was that she had a yellow Ford Pinto car, the same car that Alex Arnold said was the one following him and Kirsten that night. Well, I say it was Bernadette's car. It wasn't. It was actually her parents' car, but of course it's possible that she could have used it on the night of the murder, either without them knowing or she asked them if she could use it. Everything was starting to point to Bernadette. The car, the attacker's appearance, the FBI profile, the false alibi. It really was starting to look like she may have been the killer. And so during her interview with the police in December, the detectives showed her the FBI profile of the killer, and they asked her, "Do you think that this sounds like anyone you know?" And Bernadette actually said, "Yeah, me." She admitted that the FBI profile fit her, but she denied the murder. She was adamant that she was not responsible for Kirsten's death, which was very disappointing for the police. They were seriously hoping to get a confession out of Bernadette, because although they strongly believed by this point that she was lying, that she was the killer, they didn't necessarily have the solid evidence to prove it. All they had so far was circumstantial evidence. Obviously, this was the early to mid-80s, so DNA and forensic science was in its infancy. So yeah, they had nothing concrete linking her to the crime, and so they couldn't arrest her. They questioned her and questioned her, just hoping that she would admit to the murder, but she never did. And so eventually they did have to let her go. She was released. But she wasn't a free woman for much longer, because it turns out that Bernadette Protti was ready to confess to someone. It just wasn't going to be to the police. Clearly, this second interview with the police had spooked her. She realised that they were onto her, and so just days after she was released, she wrote a letter to her parents, and when she gave it to her mother, she asked her not to open it or read it for half an hour. She told her to wait until she, Bernadette, was out of the house before opening it. Following this, Bernadette headed off to school, and as instructed, her mother waited 30 minutes, and then she began reading the letter that her daughter had left her, and this letter left her feeling absolutely shocked and horrified. In this letter, her 16-year-old daughter had confessed to the murder of her friend Kirsten Costas. Bernadette told her parents that she was the killer that the police had been looking for. The letter reads, "Dear Mum and Dad, I've been trying to tell you this all day, but I love you so much it's too hard, so I'm taking the easy way out. The FBI man thinks I did it, and he is right. I've been able to live with it, but I can't ignore it. It's too much for me, and I can't be that deceiving. Please still love me. I can't live unless you love me. I've ruined my life and yours, and I don't know what to do, and I'm ashamed and scared. Bernadette. P.S. Please don't say how could you or why, because I don't understand this, and I don't know why." So immediately after reading this letter, Bernadette's parents instantly drove to their daughter's high school. They picked her up and they actually took her straight to the police station. They knew that she had to confess to the police, and she did. She finally did. She broke down and she admitted to the detectives that she was the one who stabbed Kirsten Costas to death, and she talked the police through her account of what happened that day. Bernadette admitted to the police that she was the one who orchestrated the fake initiation dinner for the Bobby. She was the one who left the details of this dinner with Kirsten's mother, and on the evening of the 23rd of June 1984, she took her parents' Ford Pinto car. Apparently she lied to them and told them that she needed to drive it to a babysitting job that she had booked in that night. She took this car and she drove to the home of Kirsten Costas to pick Kirsten up for this Bobolinks dinner. After Kirsten got in Bernadette's car, Bernadette drove to another town close to Orinda, the town of Moraga, and she pulled into a parking lot, and this confused Kirsten. She couldn't understand why they'd stopped in a parking lot when they were supposed to be going to this dinner, but it didn't take her long to realise that there was no dinner, that Bernadette had made the whole thing up. And according to some sources, Bernadette tried to kind of play this off and say, okay, we're not going to a Bobby's dinner, we're actually going to a party. But again, I think Kirsten eventually realised that that was another lie. There was no party, and this led to the two girls beginning to argue. Now, according to some sources, Kirsten also began smoking marijuana in the car, and she offered Bernadette some, but she turned it down, and this apparently angered Kirsten, and it led to another argument between them. But I just want to state that I'm not sure how true that is, as it's only stated on a couple of sources. I mean, we don't know exactly how the conversation went between the two girls, what exactly was said in this argument, but we do know that it ended with Kirsten getting out of the car and storming off, and as she did so, she was shouting to Bernadette, saying that she was really weird. After getting out of the car, as we know, Kirsten knocked on Alex Arnold's door and he offered her a ride home to her house, and as they started driving back towards Orinda, Bernadette followed closely behind, and Bernadette said that she was really panicking at this point. She just had this argument with Kirsten, and she was so terrified that Kirsten was going to tell people at school that she was this strange, weird girl who'd made up this fake Bobby's dinner. I have a quote from her confession here. She said, "I was afraid she was going to tell everyone I was really weird. I thought, oh my god, everything's going wrong. She's going to tell everybody." And this made Bernadette panic because all she ever wanted was to feel like she fit in at school. She wanted to feel as though she fit in with the popular crowd, with Kirsten. Because as I understand it, Bernadette kind of was in the popular group at school, but like she was right at the very bottom of it almost, whereas Kirsten was at the very top, and Bernadette was always seeking Kirsten's approval. She desperately wanted Kirsten to like her because she always felt so inferior to Kirsten. She was jealous of Kirsten and her life. Bernadette came from quite a big family, I think. She had quite a few siblings. They were a Catholic family, and they were described as being kind of like middle to upper class, so they were fairly financially stable, but they didn't have bucket loads of money. They did struggle sometimes, which was a contrast to Kirsten and her family. They were pretty well off, and Kirsten was a lot more popular than Bernadette. Kirsten always did better in school, so for example, both girls applied to join like the yearbook committee in school and cheerleading squad, and only Kirsten got in. Bernadette didn't, so she always felt less than. She always felt as though she was never good enough in comparison to Kirsten, and she hated it. But she felt as though if she could be friends with Kirsten, then maybe she could enhance her social status, her popularity status in school. If she could become good friends with one of the most popular girls in school, Kirsten, then naturally that would make her more popular. Clearly her reputation was very important to her. And I mentioned earlier on that she and Kirsten were friends in school, but actually as the police took a deeper look into their relationship, it became clear that in reality that wasn't really the case. I mean, they were friendly because they were kind of in the same circles, but sources seem to suggest that actually Kirsten didn't like Bernadette. She had no interest in being friends with her because she felt as though Bernadette was just a wannabe, constantly copying whatever Kirsten did. So although they were, I guess, acquaintances, Kirsten didn't really like her, and she made that clear. Apparently she would make quite harsh comments towards Bernadette sometimes about the fact that she was just a follower and a wannabe, and how Kirsten had more things and more money than Bernadette. But despite this, Bernadette still desperately wanted to be Kirsten's friend. I have another quote here from Bernadette. She said, "Kirsten just sort of put me down. I remembered one time on the ski trip we were on together. I mean, we don't have a lot of money and we can't afford a lot of nice ski stuff, and I just had this really crummy scummy pair of skis and some boots, but you know, I was having fun anyway. Kirsten made some comment about them, and it just seemed like everyone else was thinking that, but she was the only one who would come out and say it. She had never liked me, but I thought she was okay. It hurt and I couldn't change, like looks or money or popularity. And so from what I can gather, Bernadette told the police that she lured Kirsten out of her house on the evening of the 23rd of June. She made up the fake Bobby's dinner because she just wanted to talk to Kirsten and try to get her to be her friend. But of course this plan went horribly wrong because Kirsten realised that Bernadette had lied, and so she stormed off and she asked Alex Arnold to take her home. So going back to where we were before, during the drive home, Bernadette was following Alex and Kirsten closely behind, and she was just in this panic state. She said that she didn't know what to do because she was so worried that Kirsten was going to tell everyone at school that Bernadette was a weirdo. Kirsten had the power to destroy Bernadette's reputation, and so when they arrived back in Orinda and Kirsten got out of the car and she began walking towards her neighbour's home, Bernadette said that she panicked even more, and so she grabbed a knife that she had in her car. She ran up to Kirsten and she just began stabbing her with it. Apparently she claimed that she never intended to kill Kirsten. She just wanted to hurt her, but whether she meant to or not, as we know, Kirsten did die at her hands. So that was Bernadette's account of what happened, and she was adamant to the police that the crime was not premeditated. She insisted that she never set out to kill Kirsten that day. She said that she just lost it in the spur of the moment. However, when it came to her trial in March of 1985, the prosecution refuted this. They stated that there was evidence to suggest that this crime was in fact planned and premeditated. Firstly, there was the whole lying about the Bobby's dinner to lure Kirsten out of the house. And secondly, what about the fact that she literally had a knife with her in the car that evening? If she didn't plan to kill Kirsten, why was she armed with a knife? Well, the defense team did put forward a possible explanation for this. They actually had one of Bernadette's sisters come forward as a witness during the trial, and this sister claimed that the knife in the vehicle was hers. Apparently she had a job where she would have to like travel a lot, and she would use her parents' Ford Pinto to travel to work, and she said that the knife was in there because she would use it during her lunch times to cut up her fruit and veg. Although a lot of people were very skeptical about this because the knife that was used to kill Kirsten was a big knife. It was an 18-inch long butcher's knife, and it was argued that, you know, most people don't usually use that big a knife to cut vegetables, so a lot of people felt that that was a lie. But regardless, when it came to the end of the trial, the judge found Bernadette Protti guilty of second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder. The difference between first and second-degree murder is obviously the premeditation aspect. If it's proven that the assailant planned the crime, then that is murder in the first degree. However, the judge in Bernadette's trial ultimately felt that the prosecution did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this crime was premeditated, and so they found Bernadette guilty of second-degree murder. And because of this, and because of the fact that she was a minor, she received a sentence of only 9 years. She was going to have to spend 9 years in a juvenile facility. Although she never ended up serving her full sentence. She only served about 7 years before she was paroled in 1992 and ultimately released. She was released at 23 years old. She served just 7 years for brutally stabbing someone to death. Of course, as you can imagine, Kirsten's family were absolutely outraged and devastated when her killer was released. Understandably, they felt as though she should have spent a lot longer locked up, and they were angry because during her time in the juvenile facility, Bernadette got to continue her studies, she got to finish high school and sit her exams, she received her GED, she got to do all of these things and have all of these opportunities that she stole from Kirsten. Upon her release, Bernadette changed her name, she moved to a different state, and she went on to get married and have children. And as far as I'm aware, she has never been in trouble with the law since. I think she just lives a very normal life now. Today she would be in like her mid-50s, I believe. 10 years after Kirsten's murder, a made-for-TV movie was released based on this case. The movie is called Death of a Cheerleader, and then I believe it was remade again just a couple of years ago in 2019. I haven't seen either of them, but do let me know in the comments if you have. But yeah, that concludes this case. That is the case of Kirsten Costas. A really horrific crime. Kirsten was just 15 years old, and despite the kind of person that she may or may not have been in high school, she did not deserve what happened to her. She deserved to live her life and not have it cruelly snatched away. But yeah, that is it for this case. I really want to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions on this case in particular in the comments. Please do let me know what you think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know in the comments, or alternatively I do have a case request form linked down below in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!